today we are moving finally even further away from the Civil War because we did the Reconstruction era in that short little 15-minute video I had you guys watch from YouTube. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully the definitions were helpful too, and we have kind of an understanding of what the country looked like following the Civil War. But now we're going to move to maybe slightly more positive things. We'll see. There's a little bit of everything today. But we have, the Civil War era, we had the Reconstruction era, and now we're moving on to something that's called the Gilded Age, or Gilded Era, depending on which word you want to use. Let's put that up here. So, we had the Civil War era, Civil War age. We had Reconstruction. And now we have this thing called the Gilded Age. So let's think about that for a second. Do we know what gilded means? The word gilded. Maybe we've heard it before. Maybe we've heard it in relation to jewelry or decoration or something. Because gilded literally means to be covered in a thin sheet of gold, like gold leaf or something like that. So it means wealth, it means luxury, but it also implies that this kind of expensive appearance is only on the outside. That it might be hiding something that's not so expensive within. Because it's gold that covers something that's not as expensive as gold to make it look like gold. So let's talk about why the word gilded might be used to describe this era, this time period after the Civil War. So we're looking at a time period that starts around the 1870s. It overlaps a little bit with Reconstruction. Because Reconstruction goes from end of the war, 1865, I think, to about 1877, I think. So Reconstruction starts in the early 1870s, so there's a little bit of overlap here. But for the most part, the Gilded Age kind of carries us out into the turn of the century, into the year 1900. So why might we call this era the Gilded Age? So, the Civil War, as we know, from talking about Reconstruction, from talking about the economy, the Civil War devastated the South. The Southern economy was forever changed following the Civil War, and experienced great economic hardship, both from losing property, having property destroyed, losing so many lives as a result of the war, and also losing their prime source of their economy, their slaves. So we know the Southern economy is pretty desolate right now. However, the Civil War did not have that same effect on the North. If anything, the Civil War gave the Northern economy a huge boost. And do we remember why that might be? It's because, if you'll remember, when we talked about the differences between the North and the South at the start of the war, in the North is where all the factories are. So these factories are making war supplies like uniforms, weapons, wagons, railroad parts. So the Northern economy, the Northern factories are actually flourishing during the war, and they continue to do so afterwards. Because during the war, the demand for these things, for war supplies, weapons, those kinds of things, go up dramatically, and the factories are pushing to meet those needs, and they start working faster and producing more than they ever thought they could. And this newfound realization of the extent to their own productivity leads to this great increase in industrialization. Suddenly they're like, oh, instead of producing 5 of these a week, we can actually produce 50 if we just work hard enough. And they continue that trend even when the demand is no longer there after the war, because it makes them more money, and businesses start to grow faster. So in the period of from the end of the war, from 1865 to 1900, roughly 35 years, the United States experiences an explosive growth in all different areas. So the population of the nation actually triples during this time. Agricultural production doubles, and get this, industrial manufacturing, so the kind of thing we're talking about with northern factories, grows 6 times over what it was before the Civil War. And it's during this time period where companies and factories are just growing and growing and growing at exponential rates that we get a term called big business. simple term, but this is a term being used, it's coined in this post-Civil War era to refer to companies and corporations that are going to be growing at these exponential rates following the war and following wartime production trends. And one of the results of this growth in industry is a growth in national wealth as well, and an overall increase in standard of living for most people. So while you don't really necessarily have everybody getting rich, you do have everybody kind of being bumped a little bit higher up the ladder. So not to say the poor people aren't still poor, but they're a little bit less poor in comparison with people who might be living in other countries. So it's not that America doesn't have a poverty problem in this period, because they absolutely do and they always have, but the standard of living is all being bumped up a tiny bit. And depending on where you are on the ladder, it might be more obvious than others. But, of course, we've learned about industrialization before. So if you'll remember, we talked about in the first half of the 19th century, so in the early 1800s, we talked about industrial growth then. We talked about, Cyrus McCormick, we talked about Eli Whitney, the cotton gin, railroads. We're going to talk about railroads again today briefly. But one of the things we also talked about when we talked about industrialization earlier in the century is the negative effects of industrialization, and that still plays a big role in the Gilded Age, and is one of the reasons why the word gilded might be important. Because of course, every time you have massive industrial growth like this, that also means that you have massive negative side effects as well. So if you remember us talking about the working conditions in the Lowell mills that led all the women who worked there to leave and basically give their jobs to Irish immigrants instead, you get something like this here as well. So the downside of this post-war era of industrialization is that all these companies and corporations grow faster than new laws could be made to manage and control them. And it's always the workers, it's always the smaller people in the corporation that are going to pay the price for these oversights. So before we get into more detail about the problems with big business, let's talk first about some of the people, one person in particular, who was instrumental in establishing this trend of big businesses. Because there were quite a few different names we could throw out right now. Andrew Carnegie is one of them. He was majored for the steel industry. J.P. Morgan for the financial industry comes around this time period and does what he does. But the name we're going to talk about today that I picked is a name you've probably heard before. So with the rise of big businesses comes the rise of the certain people who end up leading the businesses to success. And like I just said, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, these are names that we've heard before. So these people that kind of lead these big corporations and companies are sometimes referred to as the barons of business, because they come to their own during the Gilded era. Because they turn their innovation into wealth and influence, even if they sometimes use potentially illegal or shady means to get there. So we're going to talk about one of them right now, briefly. And the one I picked, his name we should all be familiar with, John D. Rockefeller. So John D. Rockefeller, he was born in New York in 1839, but he was raised in Cleveland, Ohio. So he's born in the East, he kind of migrates to the Midwest as a child. And as he grew up, he was passionate about systematic organization. He was a very organized person. Everything about his life needed to be precise, it needed to be efficient. And these kind of trends in his behavior translate into the way he operated business. So he applies these qualities to the business that he chooses to go into, which is oil refining, to be very specific, although it soon becomes more than that eventually. So why is oil such a big deal right now in at the time Rockefeller is getting into it, the 50s and 60s? So even during the Civil War, oil starts becoming a big deal in America. So why is that? So the first oil well begins operating in Pennsylvania in 1859. So by the 1860s, this one well has led to a full-on oil rush in this area of the country around Pennsylvania. And why was oil such a big deal? Well, I mean, we use oil a lot now. Oil is still a big deal now. But even back then, it was more so because this is the pre-electricity era. We don't have electricity yet. We're going to have it soon. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we don't have electricity yet. So oil, and this refining word is important because oil can be refined into something called kerosene, which we probably heard of before. You've probably seen pictures of kerosene lamps, maybe, like those little lantern-like things, or the things you like turn to turn the light on. So kerosene was needed to provide light, to provide heat, to be able to cook, because you do use it for your stove. And Rockefeller takes advantage of this prime opportunity to kind of get control of the oil refining industry. So in 1870, so kind of marking the beginning of our Gilded Age, Rockefeller and three partners establish a company. They establish a company, that name you also might recognize as well, called Standard Oil. A very simple name, but also a very lasting name. This company still exists today and manufactures, refines, and distributes oil. So we go on to be the largest oil refiner in the nation. And for some people that would have been enough. They could stop there. You know, they already own the potentially biggest oil company in the nation. But for Rockefeller, that wasn't enough. Rockefeller wanted to have a monopoly. So we probably heard this term before as well. Monopoly meaning that he wanted to monopolize. He wanted to have, own all the oil refining and manufacturing companies. He wanted to be the only person in the country who was getting oil out to people who needed it, because then he could control the prices. So what he started doing a couple different things to make this happen. The first thing that he did is something in economic terms that's called horizontal integration. And that sounds like a funky definition, but it's actually pretty simple. Horizontal integration just means that he starts buying up other oil companies that aren't his. And it's called horizontal integration because he's reaching out to his peers horizontally, company over here, company over there, and he's buying them, and he's integrating them all into one. He's like bringing them together. So if you think of it as a horizontal line, here's a company, here's Rockefeller's company. He kind of just pulls them all in to himself and integrates them into one big company. So that's horizontal integration. Economists study that. Now businessmen study horizontal integration. Now use it continually, and that's his first strategy. Horizontal integration. Very simple. Starts buying up any company that he can. But that's still not enough. He buys up as much as he can. At this point, he owns 90% of the nation's oil refining and manufacturing. So he's very, very close to monopoly. And once again, any other person might say, okay, this is enough. I'm about as close as I can get, and I'm making a lot of money, and I'm very successful. Let's leave it there. Rockefeller doesn't think that way. He still is pushing for a complete monopoly. So he has another strategy that he uses. Vertical integration. Another term that's big economic term. This one is also very simple. So if horizontal integration was just buying up the other companies around you, vertical integration means going for the process of producing your product itself. So by that I mean that at this point, Rockefeller only works with oil refining, because when you pull the oil out of the ground, you have to refine it, you have to make it clean, you have to clean it, you have to do a lot of things to it before it can become kerosene, before it can be something that's used. So he only works in the refining process, and that's kind of just the last step in the ladder. Before then, you have to get the oil from the wells, you have to build the wells, you have to transport the oil somewhere along here. There are all these different steps. And if you put all those steps in a vertical line, well, you have to pay people to do these other steps so you can do your last step. He has to pay people for, barrels to put his oil in, and X, Y, Z, those kinds of things. So vertical integration means that Rockefeller starts to own the steps in the process instead of relying on the middleman to do those for him. So he starts to build factories that could make wagons and oil barrels to transport them. He buys his own storage tanks for the oils and tanker ships to move oil. And as soon as he starts cutting out all these middlemen, his profits start increasing exponentially. And then he's still not done, which is the other amazing thing. So he's done horizontal integration, he's done vertical integration. And what else is he going to do? Well, he can't buy every single company, because not every oil company is going to sell to him. So he decides to create something called the Standard Oil Trust. So what's the Standard Oil Trust? A trust is an organization that turns a business like Standard Oil from a corporation to a trustee. A trustee meaning someone who's in charge of something. So a trust manages other companies' stocks and stockholders. By stocks and stockholders, I mean other people that are allowed to buy shares in the company. So maybe I don't own Amazon, obviously, but I could buy some Amazon stock and I'll own a very tiny percentage of the company and I'll make money based on that percentage. A trust manages stocks for other companies. It's a little bit like a bank. So the Standard Oil Trust controls all the money from the stockholders. The stockholders, people will buy stock from the trust, and the trust will pay them their dividends or the money that they're owned. But the money will exist within the trust, not necessarily the company it's coming from. So all these other little oil companies are all paying into the trust, and the trust is putting out to all the investors. And why is that beneficial for a trust? What's the point? Well, think of it like a bank. A bank uses the money that people put into it to make more money. The trust does the same thing. The money that the company puts in, they can use for any company that they have. The money can spread in all directions. And then they just pay out to the investors, and then they can keep the rest and use it however they need to. Now, the United States government is starting to notice Rockefeller and his monopoly, and they're starting to get nervous about the fact that one person could possibly control, or already does mostly control, all the oil in the country. And when he creates this trust, that's kind of the last straw, in a sense. So they start trying to curb him at this point. And Congress in 1890 passes something called the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is basically just something that's supposed to keep people from making these trusts. So no more trust is what the Sherman Antitrust Act basically says. However, the problem with the Sherman Antitrust Act was because, well, the nature of a trust and how it functions in and of itself is pretty complicated. It was a new thing at the time. And not only that, the bill was pretty unspecific in what was allowed, what was not allowed, and what was legal and what was not legal. So it honestly didn't really do a whole lot to curb Rockefeller and his trust and his monopoly. So basically, that's who Rockefeller was. That's a kind of a snapshot to what a big business looked like as it grew, and to what a big business baron looked like. And despite all these efforts, the Sherman Antitrust Act, there were other things the government did to try to curb Rockefeller and his oil company. Despite all that, Rockefeller and his descendants were, and still remain, some of the richest family in the United States because of business strategies and practices like the ones Rockefeller used to establish his big oil company. So I'll give you guys a second to write that down, come up with any questions. Awesome. All right. So let's go back to our definition of gilded as we continue in this video. So remember, gilded was something that's not entirely gold. Gilded is something that's covered in gold. So Rockefeller and his other businessmen who are making all this money, so Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and Rockefeller, if they're the gold sheet, what are they covering that's underneath that's not gold? Because that's what the name gilded kind of implies. So there are a couple answers to that question. So the quick one is that they're covering a lack of refinement and culture. Because up to this point, wealthy people in the nation were also the ones who could trace their families back the furthest. So some of them even potentially to nobility in Europe. But now the United States was a country where seemingly ordinary people like Rockefeller and like Carnegie could reach greater monetary status without having this nobility in their background. So there's a little bit of that in the definition to begin with. The fact that they have gold and wealth on the outside, but inside they don't have the refinement of European nobility. So there's that. But there's also another aspect to this idea that all that glitters isn't gold, that comes from the Gilded Age. And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the class. So as we know, businesses like railroads and factories not only allowed corporations to grow, they also provided hundreds of jobs, new jobs, for American people. But these jobs were mostly aimed at, or mostly required to use unskilled workers. So people that didn't necessarily need to be trained for these kinds of jobs. So these kinds of jobs, like, working on a railroad, working in a factory, attracted immigrants, women, and children were the most likely candidates for these jobs. Many people from rural populations in the South and the Midwest migrate to the North to take advantage of these opportunities, even though at the time American industrial industry had the highest rate of workplace accidents and deaths in the world because they had a complete lack of safety regulations. They had basically nothing that told them what they could and could not do and what they needed to have in their places of business. So few machines had safety devices, almost none. Factories and mills rarely ever had fire escapes. Respiratory diseases were very commonplace in mines and textile mills because you have coal dust, you have chemicals, you have lint that you're breathing in the air and there's no ventilation. And then you also have child labor that's increasing dramatically. So by 1880, 1 in every 6 children under the age of 14 are working full-time jobs, usually in factories, canneries, coal mines, those kinds of things. And they're dark, they're unventilated, and they're dangerous. So that's kind of what the working class situation looks like in America during the Gilded Age. And this is probably one of the biggest, pointers of what you see, like all the glitters is in gold. The richness of the big business barons is kind of covering the lack of safety for their working class employees. So I said before we talked about the railroad today. So we've learned about the American railroad system before when it first started becoming a big part of the nation in the first half of the 19th century. So the early 1800s, we see railroads. And in the Gilded Age, following the Civil War, the boom in railroads kind of happens again. And it's one of the greatest catalysts for America becoming this urban industrial nation, so this nation that depends on, works through cities and factories. Because you have trains that are bringing all these products and these people from one place to another. And also, to have more railroads, you need materials to build railroads. So things like steel, coal to run them, leather and glass, because you need to, make the actual railroad cars, timber, wood for the tracks. All these things are being demanded in mass production to make railroads. And so these factories are obviously booming, the railroads are booming, and it's kind of a give and take situation. Railroads also were the first corporation to create this idea that you could buy stock or shares and own your little piece of the company. Even if you were just, an ordinary person, you could buy a little partial of the railroad. They also employed the most people in the nation at the time. They needed the most amount of jobs to, build the railroads, operate them, and maintain them. But of course, that also means that they fall victim or, aren't exempt from the safety cuts that sacrifice many workers' safety for the company's profits. So between 1888 and 1894, so this is a 4 or 5, 6 year period, some 16,000 railroad workers were killed on the job, and 170,000 were maimed on job accidents. And the United States was the only industrial nation during this era that didn't offer any kind of insurance for accidents that happened on the job. I mean, never mind insurance for you in your regular life, but there was no insurance if you got hurt at work. That was your problem if that happened. And these are like some staggering numbers you see of people working and then potentially having their livelihood completely taken away from them if they're injured to the point they can no longer work. And then to top all that, I mean, you kind of suspect it now. Railroad management was oftentimes very corrupt. One of the Union Pacific, head of the Union Pacific Railroad at one time said, "Our method of doing business is founded upon lying, cheating, and stealing. All bad things." Railroad management tried to get involved in politics by bribing politicians with railroad shares and, trying to swing elections that way. So it went even beyond their workers. They started trying to control government and federal issues. And unbelievably, kind of despite all this, the railroad becomes a symbol of progress. It becomes a symbol of prosperity in the United States. I mean, we've heard the song, I've Been Working on the Railroad, and that song was written during this time period, which romanticizes working on a railroad all day long and loving that kind of job. And then the completion of the first transcontinental railroad, so a railroad that stretches from one end of the country to another, is also a source of inspiration, because it's literally closing the gap from one end of the country to the other and inviting people to be able to participate in new jobs, new opportunities, and this idea of prosperity. So that's another example of why the Gilded Age is a suitable title for this era, because you have these kinds of numbers. 16,000 dead, 170,000 maimed with no help afterwards. And yet you also have a romanticized idea of what it's like to work and live in a country where you have these amazing railroads. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, and it's interesting to think about that way. And so what kind of happens? What results from these kinds of numbers? Do the workers just let it happen? They do not. And that's what the last thing we're going to talk about today is the response to these negative situations that workers were put through as they existed during the Gilded Age. So these working conditions that lay below this gilded exterior led to many working class attempts to protest the deplorable treatment they had to suffer under. So let's look at the year 1877. We'll kind of zero in on that year for a second. So in 1877, there was a great rise in railroad companies slashing workers' pay by almost half because there had been a financial panic in 1873. The reasons of that panic we don't have to talk about, but know that 4 years before they had experienced a financial crisis in the country and the railroads were still suffering. So in 77, they go and cut their workers' pay by a lot. They cut it by, I think, 35% first, and then later go and cut it by an extra 10%. And the workers get angry. So in what's now called the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, thousands of workers, they burned 39 railroad buildings and destroyed more than 1,000 railroad cars and locomotives. So this wasn't just a protest, a full picket line that we kind of picture when we see protests today. This was violent, very violent. This was the very first, and this is important to know, the very first nationwide labor uprising. It affected railroads everywhere. And it took help from the U.S. militia to put it down and calm everything down again. It was the first, certainly not the last though. So we're going to talk about one other one, which happens a few years later. So this is the railroad one, 1877. Great Railroad Strike, first nationwide working protest about wages and conditions. And it's violent. It destroys property that belongs to the railroad. So what's the other one? Following about 9 years later in 1886, we're in Chicago now. Chicago with all its factories. So around 40,000 workers strike to support an 8-hour workday. Because at that point, an 8-hour workday wasn't mandated, and companies were pushing back against having to mandate their workers to only work 8-hour days. So violent clashes start breaking out between the strikers and non-union workers hired to replace the strikers. So what that means is that when a factory would have workers go out on strike, they would go out and hire people that weren't members of a labor union, who weren't striking, and get them to work for them. These were often people who were very poor, who were very desperate to work, and most of the time they didn't want to do this because it kind of put them against the strikers, and usually they supported the strikers' cause. But when they needed money so badly, they sometimes would do this anyway. So these non-union workers who were kind of called in to fill in and take the strikers' jobs were called, not scrubs, scabs is the right word for that. Scabs. People who were hired to replace striking workers. So we have violent clashes between scabs and the strikers, because the strikers feel like the scabs are betraying the cause. The scabs just want to be able to support their families, and you have that happening in Chicago in 1886. As kind of a fun fact, if you remember learning about Cyrus McCormick and his Reaper, this whole outbreak happens in front of the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company plant. During these clashes, 2 strikers are killed when the police came to break up the fight. They fired shots, and 2 strikers were killed. And as a result, the leaders of this whole movement were so angry that they organized another protest to take place the following night. And this is the protest whose name we need to remember. So the following day, they organized a protest at a place called Haymarket Square. So this rally the next day at Haymarket Square starts out peacefully. They're just giving speeches and talking, talking about the situation in the workforce. However, the speeches start getting angry, and when they start getting angry, the mob starts getting angry, and maybe they appeared more angry than they actually were. So the police, who were clearly on edge from the following day when 2 strikers were killed, come to break up the Haymarket Square rally. The rally is on its way to disperse anyway, but the police come and start trying to forcefully continue it to disperse. And then somewhere in the confusion between the mob and the police, at this point there are hundreds of policemen there trying to control the people, someone throws a bomb at the police. So you have a bomb thrown at the police. It injures and kills dozens of policemen, and the remaining policemen open fire on the mob, not knowing where the bomb came from or who threw it. So the Haymarket Square riot, which it's now called, Haymarket riot, the Haymarket Square riot, is considered the site of America's first terrorist bomb. And that our first terrorist bomb came through the labor movement. And this results in the banning of all labor meetings in Chicago for an indefinite period of time afterwards. So we don't have time to talk about the rest of the labor movement. There was a lot of other factors, a lot of other riots and rallies and big names that kind of helped bring rights to workers all over the country. So the labor movement does eventually prevail. We have safety standards, we have 8-hour working days, we have, at least to some extent, benefits for workers and rights that they can exercise. But this is just kind of a small sample of the struggles that occurred between workers and big businesses as the businesses fought for their right to profits and the workers fought for their lives and rights to safety to kind of get where we are today. And people argue that we still need more improvements, and that's probably true. We can always, improve that relationship. But if you remember 2 things from the labor period of the Gilded Age, or the labor fight during the Gilded Age, they should be, the Haymarket Square riot and the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. So those are the 2 most important things to take from this. Okay, so let's sum up a little bit, because I know this video has been a little longer than some of our others have. So as the nation enters the 1900s, so the period we've been looking at right now has been from about 1870 to 1900. So as we enter the 1900s, the business, the corporate, and the working climate of the United States is forever changed, pretty much. Rockefeller, other business barons like him, gave the American dream new layers. Because before, when we thought about the American dream, we kind of thought about it in terms of manifest destiny, new opportunities to start new lives on your own, 20 acres and a mule kind of thing, if you've heard that term, starting with 20 acres and a mule and your family. But the American dream is changing now. The American dream is becoming industrial as the nation becomes industrial. People now dreamed of wealth and prosperity in ways they never had before, and they take those dreams with them into the 1900s, and we're going to see those dreams kind of materialize and appear when we think about the jazz age of the 1920s. So the one side greatly protested the negative aspects of this kind of prosperity. So Andrew Carnegie, the mogul of the steel industry, once wrote, "Not evil but good has come to the Anglo-Saxon race from the accumulation of wealth by those who have the ability and energy that produces it." But obviously we know some of the leaders of the working class protests believe that it's too dangerous for just a small group of people to have control of so much of the nation's wealth. And the government and Congress, through things like the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was really targeting Rockefeller and others like him, also seem to have that in mind, that this is a problem that we have people that have this much wealth in the country. But overall, the Gilded Age is a time of great business and technological innovation. We didn't have time to talk about the technology on that time in greater detail, but it's important to know that both the telephone and the electric light bulb are invented during this time. So they start shrinking the world a little bit, as you can call people on the phone, and widening the length of days too, because before, things would kind of stop when it would get dark. Then you've got an electric light bulb that can keep your house and your workspace light long after it becomes dark. So the nation is reaching great heights of prosperity that it's never known before, but we've said already, not all that glitters is gold, multiple times in this video. It's a little bit of like, a pun at this point. So in the next couple videos, we're going to talk about what else this not all that glitters is gold means for this particular era and its events, and how that translates moving forward into the 20th century. So yeah, I will see you in our next video. See you then.